Conflict surrounds the differences in Western and Eastern culture. Even many cultures in the Eastern Hemisphere are suffering from conflict right now. But although cultures allow for differences, it is not the root cause of global conflicts. It is hard to define certain cultures when they are always changing. So it is kind of also a pain of the neck to define globalization efforts by the melting pot of cultures into a westernized world. Instead, we must work with such cultures and preserve the differences while addressing necessary changes towards our collaboration. So, in that, there's an elephant in the room to be addressed when it comes to globalizing the world into a developed sea of nations. We understand that one part of globalization is poverty, another part is the transfer of information, goods, and services, and another is the elimination of many diseases, such as HIV. But the elephant in the room is none of those. The elephant in the room is illiteracy, and it's connected to all those things. And more importantly, it underlines them. But before we move on, I would like to outline the three themes of what will be shared. First, the profound existence and impact of illiteracy in today's world, and where is it located? Secondly, the current and future plans to improve the literacy efforts worldwide. And third, how the success of literacy in the 21st century defines the success of globalization. To define illiteracy, many educational and humanitarian organizations like UNESCO and the World Health Organization share an agreeable definition on illiteracy. It is the inability to read and write sufficiently to participate and grow in a society. Another way we can phrase this is functional literacy, such as reading a medicine label, filling out a job application, working out the correct change at a supermarket. So you see, as Californians, we live in such a way where these skills are intuitive, I hope. And we take for granted the sovereignty and the individual empowerment that being literate in a modern society provides to us in our daily lives. Who has been to a store, a household, maybe a temple, where the language, the customs, the means of functioning are very different to what you have identified with your entire life? I know for me, I have been in those situations, and I feel in those situations mentally paralyzed. It's hard to make decisions when you do not know if your decision will end up being embarrassing or shameful or dangerous. So I fail to function, even at a minimum. Now think about those who live without the means to function in a developing country, or even for that matter, a developed country. They too are mentally paralyzed. India, home to 1.4 billion people and growing, being an advancing country in the last couple of decades, has the largest population of illiterate adults, about 300 million, which is roughly the size of the population of the United States. Now, speaking of the United States, there's a program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, and it's used by the Department of Education to track illiteracy rates. And it shows that 1 in 5 US adults, 130 million, read at or below a level 1 proficiency level, that of a third grader. These people are unable to successfully determine the meaning of sentences, read relatively short text to locate a single piece of information, or complete simple forms. We can consider this, my friends, functionally illiterate. There's also a hotspot right now for illiteracy. It's the sub-Saharan Africa, where more than 1 in 3 adults cannot read, and 22% of children are not in school. Overall, the UNICEF states that nearly 1 billion people will enter the 21st century unable to read a book or sign their names, and 2/3 of them are women. How do we expect the children of today and tomorrow to grow with corresponding nations, let alone grow with their own communities? How do we expect those children to read the works of Dante, religious scripture, or let alone the daily newspaper to inform themselves and form their own identity? How do we expect our children to handle and understand technology, let alone be employed in a job that uses it? I'd like to bring forth an equation that can sit in our minds for the rest of this talk. It is that illiteracy plus unemployment equals poverty. For those 130 million illiterate adults in America, 1/3 of them are unemployed and 43% are in poverty. Now, as we've seen in the COVID pandemic, many people do become unemployed, but that does not mean that they are subject to poverty. They have a way out. They have their skill set. They have a network that could provide opportunities, and they can communicate through those networks. And those two things come from the ability to be literate in this country. So by that definition, those who did not have adequate education suffered the most in the labor force. According to a map of necessities for a human being, like this one shown here, someone who is impoverished and has to provide for their family may not have the time to read a book or go to school, and therefore a loop of functional illiteracy and poverty makes its rounds through generations of families. But then the question comes up, what if we did supply the necessary resources for people to have and then utilize adequate education? What will that do for our country? Let's put it this way. A level 3 proficiency score is equivalent to a 6th grade reading level here in the United States. On average, people with a 6th grade reading level make $63,000 per year. And a Gallup study mentioned previously with the data that we collected with the 130 million illiterate people in the United States, they estimate that raising every American adult's literacy rate to a 6th grade reading level would generate an additional $2.2 trillion a year for the US economy. Now, this is what is possible in the West, where we, in fact, do have the money, we have the resources, we have the system to make generational change. But on the other hand, the Eastern Hemisphere has the same root problems with literacy and unemployment, but the effect is defined in terms of something else, which we call multidimensional poverty. Multidimensional poverty is not only lacking the finances that allow you to survive, but also the lack of clean water, the lack of electricity, the lack of an access to healthcare, the lack of overall primary education. So if someone has the financial sum to be considered middle class, they could still be in poverty. And yes, we hear this on a yearly basis as Westerners, but what does that mean? What does it currently mean? Well, 21 out of 46 member states, almost half, of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation are classified among the least developed nations in the world, including the bottom 5 on that list. Now, I would like you to close your eyes. Imagine you are a child in Nigeria, and you are one child of 130 million who are in poverty. The nearest school to your village is 13 miles away, but you cannot go because your family needs you to get water, and the nearest pond is 6 miles away from your village. Throughout the day, you collect water, you braid hair, you pick up trash, you collect wood, all in an attempt to earn $1 a day for the day's meal. This is your life. It always has been, and you have never known it to be any other way. You can open your eyes. And maybe you can feel the underdeveloped nature of many people in Eastern countries, including Nigeria. Nigeria has an overwhelmingly youth population, but 63% of the Nigerian people are in poverty. Similar to this demographic is India, which also shares a bulk of its population in the youth. India was one of the fastest growing economies last year, but I don't state that this statistic to let that fool you that poverty is being addressed. It is the businesses that are creating this economic boom, while there are hundreds of millions of people that don't even know what a modern day business is. Most of the impoverished people are living in villages. But still, it cannot go unnoticed that India has dropped its poverty levels from 640 million in 2005 to 370 million in 2017. Now, how is this possible? What are they doing? As the UNICEF said and stated that women are the majority of illiterates in the world, 2/3. Female literacy often lags behind men in India as well. Currently in Rajasthan, which is the largest and most rural geographic state in India, the average literacy rate is 67%, but only 52.6% for females. They're below the average literacy rate. There's been confounding factors, though, that have been studied that dictate whether women in India will go to secondary or higher education. Some of those being domestic violence, child labor, inadequate menstrual hygiene, or the embarrassment of going to school during the period of time, and also child marriage. I would say all these factors, including menstrual hygiene, are based on the lack of knowledge, or so I say literacy, health literacy, moral literacy, as well as functional literacy that make these factors culturally accepted in India for women, where women are seen as property that are transferred from father to husband, especially in underdeveloped rural villages like those in Rajasthan. For India, the first step was initiating compulsory education for children. In 2010, the Parliament of India established the Right to Education Act, doing just this. In 2000, enrollment rates were just above 73% for girls in India. And as a result of the Right to Education Act, enrollment rates into primary schools are now recorded at 93% for girls. And that is just the start of granting literary sovereignty to the next generation. Nigeria is also working towards better goals itself, with plans to lift 100 million Nigerians out of poverty by 2030. But the theme that I insist upon is that functional literacy should be a key priority as a catalyst for long-term resilience and development. And although enrollment rates have increased in these Indian primary schools, which are equivalent to elementary schools, there are significant dropout rates going into secondary schools, which are middle and high schools here in America, and post-secondary college education. There are still considerably high dropout rates for Indian girls in these schools. And this is another problem that we can address as a community college audience in the form of something we call early college high schools. These schools were developed at LaGuardia Community College in New York City in 1974. The model of a high school located on and into the community college environment was developed to lower high school dropout rates among those who were termed high-ability, at-risk youth. This program enables students to obtain a quality high school education at the same time of receiving direct access to college courses and services. Now we see this here at Mission, where there is an active dual enrollment process for students who are in secondary school preparing for post-secondary. The American Institute for Research found that these schools not only held higher graduation rates, but higher enrollments into college. About 3 in 5 students for this system of education, compared to 1 in 5 for regular high schools, did just this. Now, some of us here at Mission College, we are younger, and we are currently dually enrolled in high school education as well as college courses. Some of us are older, and we are looking for an opportunity to reestablish ourselves in education for greater citizenship. Some of us come because we can't afford to attend a four-year university. Some of us don't have the means of transportation, and Mission is within our reach. And some of us are not only looking for a bridge towards further education, but more importantly, a bridge to better literacy as a citizen. A community college model provides for the community. It is a service to all in favor of education. In my eyes, and with the statistics I'm bringing forward, it seems to be a great system for developing countries. In 2004, a country in the Middle East, Kuwait, was interested in adopting the Mission College model for building a community college. Yes, a Middle Eastern nation reached out to Santa Clara, California, in hopes of providing secondary and post-secondary education. And although the timing did not work out to pursue this endeavor at the time, there is interest in building this model across the world. And yes, Kuwait is a developed country with the funds available to tackle education, but that does not mean places like India and Nigeria and the 20 other Islamic countries that are underdeveloped cannot reach out to create agendas with support of organizations and from neighboring nations. This is globalization. Globalization is the ability to extend the transfer and sharing of information to all parts of the world, rather than defining it as a melting of cultures into just one way of living. To globalize a shared network of information takes a globalized effort to first understand that information. So, to plant seeds for literacy should be an intuitive part of human rights in the progression towards a unity of nations. So what we must act on is certain principles that are primary to the ability to read and write. And that will mean intentionally aligning nations towards educational commitments to children, especially the disproportionate number of girls. And it starts with building primary schools within walking distance for children, where they can spend at least 2 to 3 hours a day in a classroom setting. So the rest of the day, they can go help their families with their necessary responsibilities. Focusing on the education of women also allows for the opportunities of a growing teacher population, which is critical to the success of any academic institution. We need qualified teachers. Lastly, the implementation of early college high schools provides an easily accessible system for students to access secondary and post-secondary education if they choose. But why does this matter to us here in this room? We're here in California. This audience here is pretty literate. Well, for one, we should be grateful for our position in society, to have the opportunities to reach higher dimensions of ourselves and to be effective citizens in the larger society. Secondly, we should be aware of the agendas that have been set forth by nations like India and Nigeria to eradicate poverty, and that might give us an incentive to be more open in sharing that cause with our global brothers and sisters. And third, we can identify globalization as a direct impact of how we as a species can spread information through our ability to be literate. Frederick Douglass, an American slave from the 19th century, fought against anti-literacy laws for Blacks. He learned how to read and write himself, and he freed himself from the slave institution. And so I hope we can end a different kind of slavery shared around the world very soon. I end this with his words. Once you learn to read, you will be forever free. Thank you.